This is part 1 of the lecture on Chapter 5, Human Population Growth. In the autumn of 2011, the global human population passed the 7 billion mark, and we are definitely a lot higher than that now because we are now in 2018, so that was 7 years ago. This rapid population growth says, some people say it's the source of all of our problems. So when we talk about Thomas Malthus, when we talk about Tragedy of the Commons, William Foster Lloyd, they all sort of talk about population because population is what increases our impact on the earth by using resources. So water, access to clean drinking water, access to all the resources we need to live what we consider a certain standard of life. This has definitely increased our consumption rates across the board, and not just in terms of natural resources, but also in terms of stuff. And so this is one of the biggest problems. Is population the problem, or is it rather the fact that we just don't adequately use resources properly? A lot of people say population is the issue. Other people think that if we could just teach people how to use resources properly, that we could solve the problem. Here's a clear example. This is Times Square in 1910, and of course this is Times Square today. And so this is just within 100 years. Look at the difference between Times Square and Times Square today. There's also, of course, population growth are really high in poor areas, and so this is one of the biggest thing is that we need, not we, but people need to be educated on population growth. Now, the United States and a lot of developed countries are what we call at 0 to negative population growth. But in a lot of other areas, poor or low income areas, people who lack education, population rates explode. And, we can't just point the finger at them because at one point the United States also had an enormous population growth. So how do we, how as a whole, and when I say we, I don't mean us, the United States, telling other people what to do. I mean as a whole in the world, how can we educate people on population without infringing upon their personal rights? So the history of human population growth, the pre-agricultural period, which extended for more than 100,000 years, coincided with the development of human culture and the advancement of skills such as tools, as well as the ability to pass those skills on to successful generations, allowed humans to adapt quickly to their new environments. And so you can see that, the population was only 5 to 10 million people at the end of the pre-agricultural period, and it lasted 100,000 years. And this is just showing you, beginning 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens then began to migrate. They migrated out of Africa and began settling in Europe and Asia and Americas. And so you can see that, once people started migrating from areas, then those separate populations could then begin to explode. The agricultural period began our period of growth, and that began about 10,000 years ago, and the domestication of plants and animals was really huge in this. The development of farming, breeding and growing livestock, nutrient-rich crops, all of that allowed population to grow. What we didn't realize and what Thomas Malthus didn't realize was that the explosion of population really actually had to do with industrial agriculture, is that we couldn't see that at the time. But with a little incremental improvements in agriculture, we actually saw huge growth in population. As you can see, within this time, doubling time was only 1,000 years, so that means we doubled our population within 1,000 years. And by the end of this period, we were 500 plus million people. So you saw that other slide was that at the end of this, it took 100,000 years, and we were only at 5 to 10 million people at the end of this period. And then within we doubled, and within 10,000 years, we were at 500 plus million. So you saw that. And a lot of that has to do with the growth. The world's 6.7 people are widely distributed, but population density, of course, varies among regions. You can see here, we have India has a very high population. We have parts of China that have very high population, parts of Africa, the United States, the eastern seaboard, some parts of Mexico. So you can see this population density, and you can see, where do most people live? So right here in Africa, most people live along the oceans. Do you see this? They live a lot of times along seaboards, and this is going to be a big issue if sea level does rise. And then after the agricultural period, came the industrial period. We had huge technological advances. We began to use fossil fuels. And usually we see a rise in population when there's access to sanitation and medication. The death rates usually decline in these areas. And now we're a population over 7 billion, which is huge. And this is just a really good graph that shows you, look at that. Here's that first period here, the pre-agricultural period. You could see it took a really long time. Then we have our agricultural period, which we saw an explosion in population and then a continual explosion. Now, at some point, and we'll talk about this, carrying capacity, the Earth can only handle so many people, the human population. And what happens is then we overshoot that carrying capacity line, and then we see a die bath. So one way we look at these different populations is what demographic transition are they in? And there's these different demographic transition models, and they kind of tell you where a population is. And we say countries are in specific demographic transitions. Where are they? So if you're in stage 1 demographic transition, as a society advances, human populations go through these stages. Stage 1 is before any economic development. There's a high death rate and a high birth rate. And usually this means because they are, families compensate for the high death rates by having, of course, more children. And usually these are really, really low developed countries. There's only about 1 or 2, and the question is whether really those countries are in this demographic transition. But there is, it's very, very, very few countries in the world that would be in this demographic transition. Countries that would be in this demographic transition would be, really small tribal areas in like the Amazon, or in Bangladesh, smaller communities in Bangladesh. So these are areas that are in this transition area. Then we move to stage 2. As society advances, human population growth goes through these stages. There is a mortality transition, meaning the death rates start to decrease, birth rates still stay high though, and these are usually areas with high population rapid growth. Countries that are in stage 2 of the demographic transition are Yemen, Afghanistan. So these are areas, although, because of war, Afghanistan's death rate has definitely increased. But these are countries that are in stage 2 demographic transition. Stage 3 is when we're in a fertility transition. The death rates stay low, and this is where we start to see the birth rates decrease. And then the population starts to grow really slow. In these areas, families may limit their number of children by using contraceptives or other means of family planning. And then the death rate, of course, remains low. So you'll see this. And this is where a cultural change starts to happen in thinking that you don't need to have as many children to do whatever you have to do. Countries that are in this transition are Mexico, Jamaica, Colombia are good examples of this. Mexico, one of the hardest things is getting contraception use in Mexico up, and a lot of this, of course, has to do with religion in certain countries. Now, stage 4 is where we're in this stability transition, low birth rates and death rates. Birth rates and death rates might actually be equal. And this is where we're in 0 to negative population growth. China, Brazil, Canada, they are all in this. This is where the U.S. is. And the reason for this is that we're pretty soon we're going to have a negative population growth. And what that means is that for every 2 adults, there's only 1.8 children being reborn. So when those 2 adults die, only 1.8 children replace 2, which means we're at a negative 0.2 population growth. And this is a big thing. It's a huge issue in terms of the economy, and why this is one of the reasons why this social security system of the United States may falter. And that's because we had this huge baby boomer population, which is in their 70s now. They were born after World War II. So after World War II, everyone came home. They had a lot of kids. And war does that in a lot of areas. And then what happens is that after that, the population, people having children became less of a priority, and there are a lot of social reasons for that. Number one is women became educated, freedom of women. Women started going to college. Women started really increasing their, after World War II, from World War II on, more women were in the workplace. And so what happened is people put off having kids till later in life. And when they did that, they had less and less children. So that fertility rate of women actually increased to, people didn't have children until they were in their 20s instead of when they were in their teens. And because of that, that leaves less time for women to have children in that viable operating stage. And so the U.S. population, childcare costs are really high. More people are in the workforce. And when women are in the workforce, they tend to have children later in life. So instead of having 4 children, they're having 2. And so the whole world is changing a little bit. And so, this is one of the things, is that there's a lot of people who push, like the World Health Organizations, a lot of the United Nations, try and educate countries on their population growth, because the less population you have and the more stable it is, we can actually look out, foresee into the future how much water we need, how many natural resources we need. And so here's just a case study on Latin America, and we could see that the Latin America region has generally followed the 4 stages of demographic transition. However, the region includes 4 separate countries, each with its own geography and, of course, cultural and religious beliefs. And as a result, the process of demographic transition, of course, varies considerably from country to country. But the hope is that all of these 46 separate countries reach stage 4 of the projected transition by 2050. And when that happens, people are able to really look at resources and manage them. So what affects global human population? Well, birth rates are influenced by a couple various factors. So the birth rate of a country, of course, it varies. And the reason for this is, of course, more wealthy countries have lower birth rates. And the reason for this is because people are educated. They realize that having more children may not be the answer to taking care of their crops, etc. And so this is a big deal. And when we see this, we see that, between like 1950 and 1910, the age-specific birth rate, or, the babies born each year, dropped from 3.75% to 1.94%. And this is a big deal, because we saw this. But remember, this is key. The more wealthy a nation, the lower the birth rates. And we can see here, these maps compare birth rates in wealth in countries across the globe. In the map, notice that the United States has a low birth rate, and that countries of sub-Saharan Africa have very high birth rates. And then you can see here, this deals with GDP. So red means higher GDP. And you can see the countries that have higher GDP have lower birth rates. The countries that have lower GDPs, below $2,000 US capita, have more children. And so if we can make these countries more wealthy, we can maybe their population growth will continue. And this is one of the big movements of trying to get women in a lot of developed countries to be educated, start their own businesses, sell fruit, sell their products, because then actually the birth rate will decrease. And so I'm going to just show you this. This is the world's wealthiest nations, and you can see here the number of babies that they have. You can see it's right around 2. And you can see here the world's poorest nations, and on average how many babies they have. And you can see that some of the poorer nations, on average, women have 7 or more children. And this is a big difference. So look at this. If these nations could become wealthier, and what I mean wealthier is, I don't mean wealthier in terms of billionaires. I'm talking about just giving them basic access to a little bit of income. You can see the differences that makes. All right, so I'm going to stop part 1 here, and I will start part 2 in the next video lecture.